Hello and most welcome to 951. So we are on the very last strip of the 900s, the last 50, and I'm really happy that I will be able to make the most of it since the inclusion of Susie Frobel. Susie Frobel or Frobel has also opened up to a great variety of where do we stand on neurology in the Germanic world. Germany, particularly Austria for some reason, but also Switzerland, has previously been out of sight for my view. I got some insight into Dutch neurology, science of cognition from Jan Eiskens, but the German still lingered outside. I would say it's sad because more or less philosophy, the continental philosophy, has been dominated by Germany and France, or the German speaking and the French speaking. So although I got some of the French, the Germanic modern philosophers, neurologists, science of cognition, and scientific philosophers has been out of reach. So this is a great opening, I would say. It's much interesting. And also happy to say some of these have actually been translated into English. I do speak some German, but it's just on a colloquial level. I will never be able to read any philosophical in German. Well, I could give it a try, but I don't think it's a good start. But since we passed the 50s and we had a lot of lectures already, let me try to do a first deconstructive take on what has been done so far. And I named this lecture 951. How chaotic systems are the only ones that give permanence, now, and knowledge. The non-fractal ones cannot carry the same information level, and they do not have any resilience to speak of. Rather a long introduction to this lecture. Let me remind you the findings of the Swiss scientist Pfeiffer, who show that only movement can carry all the information necessary to make an artificial intelligence. It will not be enough with the brain. Even though we got 100 billion neurons in our human brain, it will not cover the need, and neither can it explain how protension and retention works, because these are bodily processes, something that we already know, and somehow it's very hard to see how the brain can be singularly taken out as being the cause of why we have protension and retention, in varying degrees, of course. Oh yeah, klar. Well, here it all started somewhere, and the ideas of antiquity is a search for something that is stable, efficient, and that the methods of syllogism, proposition, their first take on empiricism, also their first take on what is epistemology. These were supposed to be tools that give to the author predictive power of the future. Ja, so Christos. Hola, Kala. Kalaise. Super. What's a minute? So the wants was predictive power, access to knowledge, and a thinking process that will end up in good results. I think it would be fair to say these were the intentions of people in antiquity to construct philosophy. Those were the wants, the desires, the telos of this thinking, to provide something that would help people to get an aid, predictive force, and be able to sort of determine the future in a successful way. We have discussed this the last 950 episodes, and it is doubtful that they achieved their goal. It could have been that they achieved something that did not do the trick, so to speak. They come up with truth with a big T, capital T, and this truth seemed to replace the telos, the goal, and to make it at least having the indications of being something shut out from the world, because you can always make yourself true. You can construct any system consistently, coherently in yourself that will make your propositions true. This is something we know. And what this truth will lead to is a stalemate. You will make yourself true, someone else will make himself true, and there we already have some sort of opposition. It will not be a working principle. It has not worked. It has led to conflicts rather than solutions, because we seem to think that establishing its truth should come first hand and the telos second hand. Truth and facts has common to put itself in a primary situation, primary position. And I have argued in these 950 lectures this is not working, this is not true, and especially that can be shown from the proposition of Gödel and his incompleteness theorem, that you can't make anything consistently coherent or coherently consistent. Neither of those possibilities are something that is doable, and that had to be proven. It is proven now, and that is a very good indication that we need to go somewhere else. And that does not mean to abandon truth. Quite on the contrary, it means rather that truth will take a second position. It's still a tool, still comes in handy. Truth means rather, in this new order, a sort of equation that can take the value true or false. This is true in the new one. Not true without a connection, not true without a reason. Truth in itself disappears here. So it's far from the suspicions of Jordan Peterson that truth gets evicted from the picture altogether. This is giving truth quite a new stamina for it to become something that will actually lead to something of an embetterment. As it is constructed now, I'm myself been a victim for that, and many other people, Bertrand Russell. So we are in good company. No need to be ashamed, but it is very easy to make oneself true and to make one's propositions true. And actually, this is questioned by Derrida and especially of Arkady Plotnitsky. If I got the time, I'm going to add him to the lecture series. But he showed that it could actually be first we establish truth and then we make up consistency and coherency after the fact. So, since we are not entering fractal time, I think it could be just to say that is a very good criticism. If you're not in fractal time, you don't even know what is coming first, coming second. Cannot be sure of that. Simply by showing with your hand this is first, that is second, is still under the proposition that the first pointing out means first and the second means second. Once more, we have dear Augustinus, who thought that the pointing gesture is clear somehow. It is not. Nothing is clear in this world if we have to trust Gödel. If Augustinus were right, Gödel would have been right as well, and quantum mechanics would have been also false. This needs to be taken into consideration. And I think this is also a better argument against the proposition of Augustinus. The old argument from Wittgenstein was that we learn language by pointing or similar devices, and thereby we inherently understand the pointing towards. Pointing gestures, for some reason, didn't need any explanation or learning according to Augustinus. He was not silly. This is maybe the most generous take on Augustinus. I would say his mistakes were not graver than the ones of Bertrand Russell or Quine or Rawls for that matter either. It is a typical Western mistake to make, and until fractality really came into the picture, that was my mistake as well. But we are talking about the promise of the antiques, that a self-locked and looped system would somehow be sufficient to have predictive power. We know that not to be the case. If we don't take the exogenous into the equation, there will be no fractal connection between the intentionally built internal endogenous structure and a healthy, richly structured exogenous intricacy. This goes to show that our imaginary power is an important part of having an objective reality, not something of a burden that was the perception of most philosophers. It's absolutely necessary. And I would not say that the position of the Greek thinker Augustinus and the earlier Wittgenstein are absolutely wrong. They are coming from a lower level of understanding. It is still understanding, and it still makes up a chaotic system, and it still has at least some resilience and some permanence to it. It's not all that bad. And it will not do us any good to start criticizing it or trying to get rid of it or any of those things that are, for instance, implied by Rupert Sheldrake, as I understand it, or at least his partner in crime, the German, what's his name? Eckhart Tolle, Get Rid of the Ego. I think this is silly business to reason in those matters, because it is a chaotic system still works, still does some tricks. It's not useless. It's not an enemy. I would say that is the old black and white thinking. And although it is something that is that you should do sometimes, I'm not against black and white thinking. You should be very resolute if there's a fire. Putting it out is the only option. But deeper thinking gives more complicated answer that doesn't really take the truth value, false or true. We need to look at the results, and we need to understand it's about levels. And sometimes, especially if you are in a society, which we are, a rationality system comes in completely, and it builds up its very own force. And let me put this into the picture, something coming from Kahneman, Clare, and also William James. That is, to be rational means to have predictive power. Externality do exist, and we are always already part of that externality. Therefore, a rationality that doesn't have any predictive power is, this is very important, is no rationality at all. There we can be completely black and white. Doesn't make any sense to speak of a rationality that is rational in itself, or that is true in itself, because we put truth value or the concept of truth a bit lower. It is always directed or lower part of the hierarchy, and it needs to obey certain rules. And one of those rules are definitely that without predictive power you are not rational. That's the end of the story. After that is of course a level, and we are talking, rather than a completely other world, we are talking about a higher chaotic system. And that chaotic system take all the ingredients that are in the old system into concern. It is broader, it's more encompassing. And this is going a bit into the fractal dimension, something I continuously encourage people to do. Go into the fractal dimension, make your reality more and more fractal. It is a learning process, and by learning that you will get more and more used to, and you will train yourself in fractality, because at the very end fractality is something learned. You do not acquire it by hand. You need to train it constantly, and you can also sort of better it as well. And those two things, both of them are very important. And what we need to do is go into the hermeneutical horizon. It is when the two horizons meet that a read-off is possible. And one horizon is the one of the endogenous. What is the subject? What is me? What I want? My decisions, my desires, my intentions, my emotional content. That needs to definitely be reached, and to the higher degree this is reached, encountered and taken in, the more the two horizons can glide into each other, and you can have a fractal readout. If one is more or less empty on a lower level, the readout will always be at the same level, or usually a bit lower. Susie Frobel talked about a value of 0.5, 50% will be maximally reached. That can actually be mathematically shown. We know today how two systems read off each other. This was unknown until recently, well, at least 20 years ago. We had no idea what representation was, and therefore we chanced. Yes, we chanced wrong. This is shown now, but it is still time to repair the damage. And there is always, and this is important to remember, it is always a sort of participatory function in everything that takes place. The outer world is interpenetrative with the inner world, and one reason for that is that we have always already been in the world. What you see around you is as much something that is completely external, and especially when we speak about exogenous, is a bit more external. But listen now, it is never ever completely external, because we have always already been in the world. So the concepts, the information, the knowledge is constricted and aided by history. I would not recognize the building in front of me if I did not have a history of buildings. A pygmy wouldn't recognize a house if he never had seen anyone. As I spoke earlier about the pygmy Kunge, he could not even recognize a flock of cows as being big animals. He thought them to be insects of a different kind. But it's still apt to speak of a movement going out and a movement going in. And that movement going out, the force of that movement decides how much of the exogenous you actually acquire. And this takes activation. We know we can look at an electroencephalogram. We can look at the brain scan and we can tell whether a person is classically inclined or more active. It doesn't look the same. The accuracy of brain scans are that great now. A lack of fractility is very obvious in the brain of a person who is more shut off both on his endogenous and his exogenous part. Lower system is classically physical. That person is living in 3 dimension and he constantly confirms his own experiences as being of truth, being real, not being fantasies, not being hallucinations. On the more saner level, the more healthier level, it is fractality that tells you whether something is accurate, truthful, real, not its origin. And you never look at experiences and try to classify them, try to put them in order in order to make sense of them. That sense comes directly from perception, and when you forcefully project outwards into the exogenous, you will also receive. You will receive what you give, and this is always a rewarding process. You get some sort of benefit from this. So your projection, your want for perception is always fueled by something you want, and that is absolutely necessary. It is not an optional thing. And you are responsible for fueling that yourself. Your attention, your intention, your will, your want for things is something that we used to foster uh, and it is like we are getting sustenance or food from the outside world. I call that food knowledge. But this is what makes the power of intention stronger. This is what is the food or energy of projection. Something that is trained, and the more you receive from your very own hermeneutical horizon, the more you will strive to get more material from that very hermeneutical horizon. It's an interactive, nested intricacy with different levels, and these levels do work in very specific ways, and they can to some level also be absolutely contradictory. That's important to understand, is that once we strive to get into another level, there will also be a loss at start, and that loss will be of the resilience that is in the former system, because it's a stable system. Maybe not that stable if you talk about the lower level, maybe not that permanent if you talk about the lower level, maybe not that aware. I think it's another. There is no now, past and present in the lower levels to speak of, but there is still some level of those things. And once we sort of ascend on the scale, we reach more, and we also get more food for thoughts. So it's a progressive development, and a healthy philosophy always take that in regard. There is no idea of doing philosophy if there is no progression. If you just establish truths or non-truths, there is no philosophy going on. Then you have gone into the loop, and the philosophy is trying to explain the loop from within somehow, in a way that literally does not really work. But the important thing here, before I go into 3 paragraphs that's going to explain these different domains a little more into detail, the important thing is that only fractality can read off fractality. These are the 2 hermeneutical horizons, and you are in charge of at least one of these horizons, or at least this is how it's going to feel in the beginning. Our ability to read off the exogenous is all dependent on what level of complexity we have managed to make within ourselves. Whereas in the MOP, the metaphysics of presence, very little reading off can be made. Therefore, there is also very little of the level of rationality, nor of intelligence, and we don't have a high degree of perception. Remember, the level of fractality tells us how much perception of the world we have. And this fits so good with the recent discoveries that there is an enormous difference in the experience of the world. We have different levels of experience. They're not comparable. Some have very little access, and therefore very little enjoyment, satisfaction from their very world. This needs to be understood, and I suggested the other day this can help for us to understand, for instance, things that are so very odd otherwise, like the caste system in East Asia. Why is it there? Could it be that the different levels of reality of human worth is actually mirrored in the different castes? It's just a suggestion, I'm not defending it. I want to explain it rather, or understand it could be a more correct word. But once you are in this lower level, from others the perception will be that you are not present in the world and that your existence is non-permanent, and you show off unawareness. So you see, in the different levels there can be different perception of who you are. You can perceive others to be lower on the scale, but the ones being higher on the scale can see things in you which is not accessible to you because you don't have that level of complexity, intricacy, and fractality. As you can hear, this goes to understand things much more deeper than the very limited model that we all acquired after the era of enlightenment, where we use like sort of Laplace demon to tell if somebody is happy with his social scale or his position in society, and that doesn't make much sense. This is one of the reasons Karl Marx were actually deconstructed, because he's showing off centrism. He makes something more central and thereby making other things decentral. And this polarity is very obvious in Das Kapital, for instance, but also in other things that he wrote and said. Oh, I felt the urge to stretch a bit. I feel more flexible when I'm standing up doing the lecture. I might continue with that in the next episodes today. Well, I have 3 paragraphs here, 3 different concepts of the whole thing. I start from the inner side of the Matryoshka and I will move outwards. The first one is also the endogenous needs to be read off. We need an interpenetrative force to really get into the inner complexities that constitute ourselves. And this is the first time I mentioned this. And this is a reciprocal thing from paragraph 2 and 3, but it also reflects what I mentioned earlier. It is that we need the exogenous also to understand ourselves, oddly enough. Exogenous fractality is important. Social context, other people, radical otherness is absolutely necessary for us to understand ourselves. That understanding doesn't come for free. Everything is started with fractality. Everything is given by fractality, and fractality is the thing that is automatically almost doing the read-off. Well, once you made yourself complex, there is no effort anymore. Fractal read-off is incredibly much easier than the lower level chaotic system. It does itself automatically in a way that still has the full force of intention. Intention, as you slide upwards, gets more fine-tuned. One could say it gets more elegant, more precise, more accurate. It's a living skill, and that living skill in the end take effort that is barely perceptible to you as a person. You just think it and then it's done. But in the movement from one chaotic system to another, quite a lot of force needs to be put into the project. We need to force ourselves, and therefore encouragement is very important. It will not be done automatically. And I would say that we need maybe a whole group to sort of support us into this project. This is more complex than stopping to smoke or changing your diet or getting into exercise habits, because it can so easily be stepped off. And I would say in the earlier parts we really need support from others. We need a system of training. And this is things that also relate to earlier insights. The skill of emotional regulation is most important. We also need to hone our resilience so that we'll be able to be more and more strengthened. This is very important. We need the strength, and this will make up for a more complex and delicate system. Think of the iterations and filigrane structures of the Mandelbrot set. A fern and ormbunke is one of those things. The very complexity makes up the structure and the resilience, the stability of the plant. The more you gain intricacies, the more you will be able to read off. That is, to understand, to be aware, and to have understanding. This will, together with the 3 other steps, make perception stronger. You will be able to have more of the world and reality. The exogenous, if you see to the endogenous, aka the reading capacity, will become stronger and stronger. This is the development dimension. This very capacity, as it gets stronger, you will be able to practice active thinking more and more also. So it's a collateral helping out of the procedure. This could be called strengthening of the fern, and I kind of like that. So you can here now see how all plants gain their strength from being fractal and intricate. And this very same goes for...
Keep it for
Okay.
tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Have a nice evening.
You too. Bye-bye. And this very same thing holds for animals, and even more so for human beings. Let's get into the second here. Projection is the constant training of one's ability to be able for an both inward and outward thrust of complexities. Once you start thrusting the complexities, they will in the beginning not yield, nothing will happen. You are not used to handle complexities. This needs to be learned by itself. But once you get accustomed to this, it takes some time. You need to learn how to take in space. You need to understand the fractal working of time, so you can reach out to time and be able to sync the rhythm of time with the internal rhythm, with the external rhythm, and thereby getting more of an objective time, which is most important for reaching the goal of getting into action. And in this process you will understand much more of what is order and sequencing, which is very important. Something I mentioned earlier with Frederick Matthias Alexander, and I realize more and more that is much more complicated than he suggests. quite certain when he spoke about his own life and his own doing. But since he had this incredible intuition, which is something of a learned skill, and that he had already before he started with his own technique, that will not be transferred completely by his technique. We need this otherness, and that might make up 80-90% of the Alexander technique, and it's strictly not included in an Alexander lesson or an Alexander book. It should have been there, but we will help out with this. This is very coercive and co-inhabited with what I'm trying to go through. To get a persistent force in these projection powers, one need to be both resilient and strong, and we need to adhere to specific trainings to do that. This will not come just by the old metaphysics of presence, understanding it, saying yes, nodding, ticking in the box, and saying I have understood. No, not at all. That actually will lead to no understanding at all. And understanding is when you change your system. That is understanding. And you will learn to understand what is this prana, what is the ki, what is the chi. That is the projective force. But it's also the force of retention. And the reason why we use this word in English and many other languages to say that ki is an energy is that we cannot access it, and then we call it something we know is sort of powerful and can do things like energy, like electricity or fire. So this is a renaming word, and as such it is very unlucky, because it means that we renamed it and therefore we didn't know it by heart when we renamed it, and it will continue to be unknown because we renamed it, and then we make a synonym, we make a sameness, and then we end our thinking, our willingness to understand what it is. So let me here warn about the idea that prana is energy. Prana is something we still do not understand in Western society. Do not put the equalizing mark as energy. Actually, you couldn't know prana if you had it. You need to train it, and it will not make itself shown until you train it. Nothing that just turns up and said, oh, I had prana all the time. No, you don't have any prana. That needs to be acquired. And how come the Indians have it? Well, they've been training all their lives since they were very, very young. Because it is only in the metaphysics of presence where training is not part of regular life. And this is not something that needs to be expressed. Because the only thing that is expressed is the metaphysics of presence and its philosophies that says reality is passivity. So this is something that needs to be proven. It has not been proven, and therefore we can sort of put it aside. But we can't ask for a proof of what is really out there. That is just plain reality. This is both exogenous and endogenous, and it doesn't need a proposition to be a working principle. Another way of showing this is that with the lower working of the ego in this lower complexity system, the ego sucks up all the energy, because what the ego is at this level is sort of a tick, or tick. I think tick could be good. A festing in Swedish, that sucks up all the energy in the movement. And this stability, the staticness, and the randomness that we usually call determinism which is felt, experience and real, all those things, is the sucking up of prana. So a negative perception is not a perception. We cannot experience not having prana, but when we get prana, then we will be at a higher level and we can understand that once we did not have prana. This is a possible working principle. Well, what it needs, first and foremost, is a lot of training and intention. And the building up of the intentional power is a great part of this second paragraph. This is the thrust to the outwards. It starts in the endogenous, it starts as possibly a very good look to the internal. But once it has been established, it will be working more or less by itself in a manner that is not so, doesn't have to be that forcefully stretched. It will by itself work, doesn't need, once it is in the habit of moving, it will move by itself, and you will have this fluidity that Kahneman was talking about, and Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, the person behind the idea of flow. Flow is a part of the higher chaotic system. It's not a part of the lower chaotic system. It is something that you can reach. You can make it your goal. And once you achieved it, you will feel the freeness. You will feel the easy accessibility of reality and your inner working. And it will be a progressive vortex, if there is such a thing, going upwards. And for every turn you will gain more of fractality. And as I mentioned before, more fractality means more resilience, more permanence, and the ego will expand. But the problem with the ego is not that it is untrue, unreal, or an imagination. It is not the stronger thing it could have been, and it starts to build things in itself, making it true, using the truth value of the old Greeks, and trying to become coherent and non-paradoxical. And here you can also turn the table and say that the belief in the metaphysics of presence is something that always is done when you are unsuccessful and unrewarding in your exogenous thrust. That is part and parcel of the perception of classical physics. If you were successful, you wouldn't constantly change direction, you would have stability, and therefore classical physics wouldn't mean much to you, if anything. In the fractal world of reality, success is a very important part. Otherwise, your predictive power is simply not there. It is a little bit like saying, I'm very strong, but when I go down to the gym, I can't lift anything. It's in the same way a rather absurd thing to say that you are rational in yourself, but your predictive power is zero. That makes the impression that there is a rationality not of this world. It's otherworldly somehow. But once you feel this enjoyment of the world and you get more pleasure from it, a love of this endogenous starts to take place. You start to like it more and accept it more. It's an acceptance of your inner ability. And that is very important, because that leads also to an acceptance and a love outwards. And I would say fractality in itself The more complex it gets, the more satisfaction you get. Fractality is in itself satisfaction, can only be reached by fractality. And once you step out of the illusion that you somehow could reach satisfaction, happiness, successfulness without fractality, you will discard that idea and you will work even harder in getting more and more fractal. But once this power is sufficiently strengthened, you will now perceive it time to reach out into the world and make a third degree encounter with something that is truly external, the radical otherness. Possibly you will feel like Richard Dreyfuss in the movie Encounter on the Third Degree. So let's get into the third. With enough fractal power, you can now go into the apeiron, the domain of knowledge. This is something that has been feared in Western tradition. This is the horror vacui. And it can indeed be a horrific thing if you have not developed the fractality enough to encounter it. But if you have, it will be possible to reach into the radical otherness of the external, of the world. And as you will understand, the fear that has plagued Western thinking since ancient times is the very fear of knowledge. It's the knowing that we've been fearing, and to lose the power of the ego to construct its own truths, because knowledge is the epiphany of something that cannot be constructed by the ego, and it will lose its power, and at some degree it will be absolutely horrendous, and it cannot be done if you're not strong enough. Even though Rupert Spira says you can do it whenever you want to, you cannot. It could actually be horribly dangerous. Only when you're strong enough to enter into the objective external world should you do it. The ego needs to be saved. It doesn't need to be killed off. I like his brutal description of killing off the ego. This is nothing but black and white thinking. This is nothing but metaphysics of presence. It's possible that Rupert Spira is himself present, I don't know. But his teaching will not lead to presence, because they always point to metaphysics of presence and nothing else. So the going from the beetle box world, or the scarabee in the box, can be an exhausting one, but building up your balance beforehand, building up your skill in fractality, and building up your intention and wants for more satisfaction of your world and more predictive power and other things, you will be encouraged enough to get the force needed to enter into this higher level. And I think that is very important to realize. There is an actual threat to the ego. When it loses its power to construct its own world, it will be a little lag until he realizes this is knowledge. These are actual laws. They're not self-constructed. I need to follow them, and I will be happier if I follow them. And that the world actually have true limits, not constructs of only the ego. And this is what knowledge is. This is knowledge in some way about something that is unchanging. Knowledge is not something you make up. Knowledge is not the academia of renaming things only and staying in the concepts. That means staying in the same knowledge level you had once you at that time you entered into the education system. There is no progress there, Progress is needed for you to be alive. It's a very integral part of being a human being. So instead of the violent metal of Robespierre or the banning or blackening of the ego from Eckhart Tolle and Rupert Sheldrake to speak of the evilness of the I and so forth, blah blah blah. It is rather an expansion of the ego, and everything that previously was in the ego will still be at hand at the higher level. Nothing will change. It's an expansion out to the sides, up, above and underneath, and then we come into that also third factor, delta T depth. That will also be possible. Knowledge will expand. Nothing is left out of the picture. There is no loss at all. Zero. This is this moment going from the one to another that feels scary and can be threatening, but there is no loss. Could happen. The ego could go berserk, or it could be eradicated. That is the most fearsome thing that could actually happen. Not completely eradicated, but it can go down to a lower level by this self-blaming of the ego. This want of taking away the ego leads to self-blame, self-punishment, self-torture, and that will be something that spirals down. That will happen if you listen to Rupert Spira more. You will try to go down to a lower level with less of reality, and your life will work low, slower, lower, lower. Maybe a better example is Torbjörn Tännsjö, because for him morality is something that you invent yourself, and this is truly how it is for him and his followers. This is the level of degree. So it's a danger in criticizing him, as I've done in many years. I start to realize that it's saying that he's not in the right to say what he says. He is in the right to say what he says, and criticism should not be taken by him. Should be free to continue his life and living without criticism, because that is the level he's on, and he should stay there and nowhere else. But it's interesting still, we can learn from him. He makes up his own morality, and this is how it is at this level, because there is no knowledge. Of course, morality, what the world is made up of, if it's archaea, essence, all that is something we make up as human beings or subjects. And we're trying to do big boxing. But in knowledge, in the externality, in the apeiron, those things are as they are, non-changeable. And although this sounds, and it is in a way, in the step of the level, this will feel like a diminishing of power, diminishing of knowledge even at one step, one level. It is not that the case. In the higher level, we will be able to make more choices, because those are true choices that we actually can make. And we can have true changing power where it's legit. Thomas Alva Edison knew exactly what he could do and not to do, and still he lived a very fulfilling life, even more so than most other people, including myself, who don't know the limits to what I can do and know. So there's nothing scary about limits. It is actually the very substance of knowledge. And this feared thing, knowledge, the apeiron, feared, as the horror vacui, is something to be admired and live into. You can also cite here the British mathematician I mentioned the other day. What's his face now? He showed that space in itself is more than enough to make complexities enough to have matter and non-matter. Space is enough. And This is you go really into the grounds. Space gives the laws, because even the most simplest arithmetic calculations, Stephen Wolfram, even the simplest arithmetic calculations are non-repetitive. They give different outtakes for every time, and they do not repeat themselves, although we constantly think that to be the case. They actually give us more than they take away. So let's not fear the apeiron. Let's mobilize our powers. Let's get stronger and get into the apeiron so we can start truly grow as human beings. This is my appella for today. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.